Hey everyone, in this lecture we will cover connective tissue. This image represents three embryonic layers that will give rise to all tissues in our body, which are the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm. All connective tissues derive from the mesodermal layer of the embryo. The first connective tissue to develop in the embryo is the mesenchyme, which is actually the stem cell line from which all connective tissues are later going to be derived from. Clusters of these mesenchymal cells are going to be scattered throughout the adult tissue and will supply the cells that are needed for replacement and repair after you have a connective tissue injury. In addition, we can add that this mesenchyme or embryonic connective tissue is composed of mesenchymal cells that are going to look irregular in shape, meaning that they don't have a defined cell shape, that the extracellular matrix or the material surrounding the mesenchymal cells is abundant and its texture is semi-fluid, and also that there are scattered reticular fibers that at this stage is still very delicate. A second type of embryonic connective tissue forms in the umbilical cord, and it's called a mucous connective tissue or Wharton's jelly. This tissue is no longer present after birth, leaving only some scattered mesenchymal cells throughout the body. The connective tissue is made up of two basic elements, which are the extracellular matrix and several different cell types. The extracellular matrix, like the name says, is the material located between the cells, and as we know, these cells present in the connective tissue are going to be widely spread, meaning that there is going to be a lot of space between them. As you recall, this is very different from the epithelial tissue, where the cells are closely together. Therefore, between the cells, we're going to find different types of proteins and ground substance. Every organ has a connective tissue, and therefore, the composition of the extracellular matrix will be different depending on the tissue type, and this will also determine the tissue's qualities, their characteristics. These cells will give us the framework of our body, as they will form the fibrous tissue, the cartilage, and the bone. Fibroblasts, chondroblasts, osteoblasts are the cells that retain the capacity for cell division and therefore are the ones that are going to secrete the extracellular matrix that is characteristic of their tissue. In some connective tissue, once the extracellular matrix is produced, the immature cells differentiate into mature cells with names ending in "cyte", like fibrocytes, chondrocytes, osteocytes. Mature cells have reduced capacities not only for cell division but also extracellular matrix formation, and are mostly involved in monitoring and maintaining the extracellular matrix. Fibroblasts will be the cells forming the fibrous tissue, and fibrocytes will maintain this tissue. Chondroblasts will form the cartilage, and chondrocytes will maintain this tissue. Osteoblasts are the ones responsible for forming the osseous tissue or the bone tissue, and osteocytes will maintain this tissue. Within the bones or bone tissue, there is also a third type of cells which are called the osteoclasts. The osteoclasts are going to be responsible for breaking the bone down, and we will cover more about all these cells when we get to the bone tissue. Now, fibroblasts are large flat cells, as you can see here on this image, that move through connective tissue and secrete fibers and ground substance. They are the ones that will produce the collagen fibers that will form the reticular lamina of the basement membrane. Besides those fibers, they will secrete the elastic fibers and also the reticular fibers, in addition to the ground substance. And those components of the connective tissue we will talk in the next few slides. Fibroblasts are present in all connective tissue proper and therefore is the most abundant cell type. Fibrocytes, adipocytes, and mesenchymal cells are fixed cells, which means they remain within the connective tissue. Other cells move in and out of the connective tissue in response to certain chemical signals. So, for example, macrophages, mast cells, lymphocytes, plasma cells, and phagocytic cells are found in the connective tissue proper, but they are actually part of the immune system which protects the body. Like I mentioned earlier, the most abundant cell in connective tissue proper are the fibroblasts. Polysaccharides and proteins secreted by the fibroblasts, they will combine with the extracellular fluids to produce this viscous or thick ground substance that, with the embedded fibrous proteins, they were going to form the extracellular matrix. As you might expect, a fibrocyte, which is a less active form of fibroblast, is the second most cell type in the connective tissue proper. Adipocytes are cells that store lipids as droplets that fill most of the cytoplasm. There are two basic types of adipocytes, white and brown. The brown adipocytes store lipids as many droplets, and they also have a high metabolic activity. They will function to regulate body temperature in cold conditions as it gets activated right before you start to shiver, for example. There is a smaller percent of brown fat in comparison to white fat in adults. Also, in contrast, white fat adipocytes, they store lipids as a single large drop, and they're going to be metabolically less active. Their effectiveness at storing large amounts of fat is going to be witnessed in obese individuals. The number and type of adipocytes are going to depend on the tissue and the location, and they vary among individuals in the population. Some individuals, they store more fat in the belly region. Others store more fat in the thighs. Others store more fat in the gluteus region. So that's why it depends from individual to individual. We covered the mesenchymal cells already, but they are this multipotent adult stem cell, meaning that these cells can differentiate into any type of connective tissue cells that's needed for either repair or healing of damaged tissue. The macrophage cell is a large cell that's going to be derived from monocyte, which is a type of blood cells, which are going to enter the connective tissue matrix from the blood vessels. The macrophage cells are an essential component of the immune system, which is the body's defense mechanism against potential pathogens. When these cells are stimulated, they're going to release certain cytokines, which are small proteins that are going to act as a chemical messenger. These cytokines are going to recruit other cells of the immune system to these infected sites, and they're going to stimulate their activity. You can either have roaming or free macrophages that move rapidly by amoeboid movement, and they're going to engulf these infectious agents and cellular debris. In contrast, fixed macrophages are going to be permanent residents of their tissue. Just to summarize, we have macrophages that are going to be fixed and macrophages that are going to be roaming or wandering cells. The mast cell that's found in connective tissue proper is going to have many cytoplasmic granules. These granules are going to contain the chemical signals histamine and heparin. When irritated or damaged, the mast cells release histamine, which is an inflammatory mediator, which is going to cause vasodilation, and therefore it's going to increase the blood flow at the site of injury or infection, along with itching, swelling, and redness, which you recognize as an allergic response. Like blood cells, mast cells are derived from hematopoietic stem cells, and they're going to be part also of the immune system. The other cells, lymphocytes, plasma cells, and neutrophils, eosinophils, they're all part of the immune system. Plasma cells are the ones that are going to give rise to antibodies. Neutrophils are white blood cells that are going to migrate to the sites of infection. Once they get there, they're going to destroy the microbes, and they're also the first immune cells to arrive at the infection site. Eosinophils, on the other hand, they are also white blood cells that migrate to sites of infection, but this time is parasitic infection where they will cause an allergic response. Now let's cover the extracellular matrix, which is formed by protein fibers and ground substance. Within the protein fibers, there's going to be three types: collagen fibers, elastic fibers, and reticular fibers. Collagen fibers are strong, flexible bundles of the protein collagen, so it's very simple to remember, which is the most abundant protein in your body. Reticular fibers are made of collagen and glycoproteins. They're going to provide support in blood vessel walls and form branching networks around various cells like fat, smooth muscle cells, and nerve cells. Elastic fibers, they're going to be stretchable, like the name says, elastic, but they're actually very strong, and they're going to be made up of elastin, which makes sense. So elastic fibers is made up of elastin and also fibrillin. They are found in the skin, blood vessels, and also in lung tissue. The function of these fibers is to strengthen and support the connective tissue, and they're going to have different characteristics according to the tissue where they're going to be located. The ground substance is going to be the material between cells and fibers. It's made up of water, organic molecules like hyaluronic acid, chondroitin sulfate, and glucosamine. It will also support cells and fibers, which are going to bind them together and provide a medium for exchanging substances between blood and cells. Ground substance is also going to have an active role in tissue development, for example, migration of cells, proliferation of cells, and change in shape and how they carry out their metabolic functions. We can classify different types of connective tissue based on their structural characteristics, on their function, and also location in the body. Embryonic is going to refer to connective tissue that's present in an embryo, or it's going to be the mesenchyme, or in a fetus, where it's going to be the mucous connective tissue. And mature refers to connective tissue that's present at birth and will persist throughout the individual's life. There are three main types of connective tissue. We have the connective tissue proper, which is flexible and is going to contain a viscous ground substance with abundant fibers. There's going to be the supporting connective tissue, which protects and supports soft tissues of the body. And the last one is the fluid or liquid connective tissue, where the extracellular matrix is liquid, like the name says. Within the connective tissue proper, there are three types: the loose, the dense, and the elastic. These are going to be found between many organs where it acts both to absorb shock and bind tissues together. It will also allow water and salts and various nutrients to diffuse through adjacent or embedded cells and tissues. Loose connective tissue proper can be divided into three additional subtypes. We have the areolar, the adipose, and the reticular. The dense can be divided into regular and irregular. The last type of connective tissue proper is the elastic connective tissue. Within the supporting connective tissue, which is going to give support, like the name says, you're going to have the cartilage and the bone tissue. The cartilage is going to have three different subtypes of cartilages. You're going to have the hyaline cartilage, the fibrocartilage, and the elastic cartilage. The bones, you're going to have compact and spongy bone. And the fluid connective tissue, there are two types, the blood and the lymph, which is what's going to circulate throughout our body. I think that it's important for you to realize that it's a lot of information, but when we talk about bones, we can focus a little bit more on the cartilage and the bone tissue. And when we go over cardiovascular system, we'll talk about the blood. And when we go over the lymphatic system, we'll talk about the lymph. The areolar tissue is a type of connective tissue proper, more specifically the loose type. It's going to fill the spaces between muscle fibers. It's going to surround blood and lymph vessels, and it's also going to support organs in your abdominal cavity. The areolar tissue, it's going to underline most of the epithelia, and it's going to represent the connective tissue component of epithelial membranes, which are described further in a later section. Adipose tissue is the second type of loose connective tissue. It's going to contain these adipocytes, which are fat-storing cells. The importance of this tissue is to store fat for energy and also to provide insulation. Reticular tissue is the last type of loose connective tissue, and it's a mesh-like structure that supports the framework for soft organs such as the lymphatic tissue, the spleen, and the liver. These reticular cells are going to produce the reticular fibers that are going to form the network onto which other cells are going to attach to. It derives its name from the Latin reticulus, which means little net. And that's what you see right over here, this web-like structure. Now we move on to the dense connective tissue, which contains more collagen fibers than the loose connective tissue. As a consequence, it's going to display greater resistance to stretching. There are two major categories of dense connective tissue, the regular and irregular. The dense regular connective tissue fibers are parallel to each other, and they're going to enhance this tensile strength and resistance to stretching in the direction of the fiber orientation. There are going to be ligaments and tendons that are going to be made of dense regular connective tissue, but in ligaments, not all fibers are going to be parallel. In dense irregular connective tissue, the direction of the fibers are random. That's why it's called irregular. This arrangement gives the tissue greater strength in all directions, and it's going to be less strength in one particular direction. In some tissues, these fibers crisscross and they're going to form a mesh. In other tissues, the stretching in several directions is going to be achieved by alternating layers where fibers will run in the same orientation in each layer, and it is the layers themselves that are stacked at an angle. The dermis of the skin is going to be an example of the dense irregular connective tissue that's rich in collagen fibers. Elastic tissue, which is not shown here, will contain elastic fibers in addition to collagen fibers, which allows the ligament to return to its original length after stretching. So it's going to be very elastic. The ligaments in vocal cords and between the vertebrae in the vertebral column are elastic. Now we move on to the supporting connective tissue, which is going to form the cartilage and the bone tissue. The cartilage is going to be a connective tissue, of course, that's going to consist of these collagenous fibers that are going to be embedded into this firm matrix that's made up of chondroitin sulfate. There are three different types of cartilages. We have the hyaline cartilage, the fibrocartilage, and the elastic cartilage. The hyaline cartilage is the most common type of cartilage in the body. It's going to consist of these short and dispersed collagen fibers, and it's also going to contain large amounts of proteoglycans. Under a microscope, This tissue samples, they appear clear. The surface of a hyaline cartilage is going to be smooth, both strong and flexible. It is found in the rib cage, the nose, and it also covers bones where they're going to meet to form a movable joint. The hyaline cartilage, it will make up this template of embryonic skeleton before the bone is formed. During development, there's going to be a plate of hyaline cartilage that will be present at the end of bones, and this will allow continued growth until adulthood. Fibrocartilage is tough because it has this thick bundles of collagen fibers that is going to be dispersed through its matrix. Menisci in the knee joint and the intervertebral discs between the vertebrae are going to be examples of fibrocartilages. Last, the elastic cartilage is going to contain elastic fibers, like the name says, as well as collagen and proteoglycans. This tissue will give a very rigid support as well as elasticity due to the presence of the elastic fibers. If you tug gently at your earlobe and notice that the lobes return to their initial shape, this is due to the presence of these elastic cartilages. The second type of supportive connective tissue is the bone, which is going to be the hardest connective tissue. Therefore, it's going to provide protection to internal organs, like the skull provides protection to the brain, and it's also going to support the body. I don't want to go into details about the bone structure here in this lecture because we will cover it when we get to osseous tissue, but the two different types of bone tissue is going to be the compact bone, which will form this outer layer over here of the bone, and then the spongy bone, which will be located inside of the bone, especially at the ends of long bones. Blood and lymph are fluid connective tissues. Therefore, the cells circulate in this liquid extracellular matrix. The formed elements circulating in blood are all going to be derived from hematopoietic stem cells that are located in the bone marrow. Erythrocytes, which are red blood cells, are going to transport oxygen and some carbon dioxide. Leukocytes, which are white blood cells, are going to be responsible for defending against potential harm microorganisms and also molecules. Platelets are cell fragments involved in blood clotting. Some white blood cells have the ability to cross the endothelial layer that lines blood vessels and enter adjacent tissues as well. Nutrient salts and waste are going to be dissolved in the liquid matrix, and therefore they're going to be transported through the blood. In terms of lymph, it's going to contain a liquid matrix and also white blood cells. Lymphatic capillaries are going to be extremely permeable, and this will allow these larger molecules and the excess fluid from the interstitial space to enter the lymphatic vessels. The lymph then is going to drain into the blood vessels, and it's going to deliver these molecules to the blood that could not otherwise directly enter the bloodstream. In this way, these specialized lymphatic capillaries are going to transport absorbed fats away from the intestines and deliver these molecules to the blood.